Most Americans know people who've struggled with drug abuse, and we all want to keep drugs away from our children. But what kind of drug policy will most effectively provide help to those who need it and keep our children safe? There are many possible approaches, but for the past 40 years, the U.S. government has maintained the same policy: total prohibition. Most of us take the drug war for granted. In fact, more than half of all Americans are too young to remember when and how it all started.
We must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number one in the United States, the problem of dangerous drugs.
Why did Nixon declare his war on drugs? Thanks to the fact that Nixon secretly taped his conversations, we can get a glimpse of Nixon's motivations.
It was political, and it was used as a way to go after the student protesters, the anti-war protesters, and the hippies.
You peel back the history, and this whole thing started from a racist perspective.
This is what Richard Nixon said, according to Haldeman. He says, this is in the late 60s, right after the Civil Rights Movement. He says, you know, the problem is really the blacks. And what we have to do is devise a system to deal with that while not appearing to. Hence, the war on drugs.
In September 1971, Nixon met with Raymond Schaefer, a former Republican governor of Pennsylvania, to discuss the Schaefer Commission's forthcoming report on marijuana policy.
But you're enough of a pro to know that for you to come out with something that would run counter to what the Congress feels, what the country feels, what we're planning to do, would make your commission just look bad as hell.
He began the notion of saying there's no way that drug policy should be based on science. This is about politics.
In March 1972, the Schaefer Commission submitted a report recommending an end to marijuana prohibition. Nixon ignored the report, and to this day, marijuana has remained a Schedule I drug.
No therapeutic value whatsoever. Right up there with heroin.
Well, you know, Nixon's such a mixed story because his support for drug treatment was really substantial and was admirable in many ways compared to everybody who's come after him. But the other part, of course, was the massive crackdown.
Federal agents in Florida today talked up the nation's largest coke bust ever.
While the feds were busy cracking down on drugs, 11 states decriminalized marijuana, making possession a minor offense rather than a criminal act. And when Jimmy Carter was elected president in 1976, it appeared that the war on marijuana might be coming to an end.
I support a change in law to end federal criminal penalties for possession of up to 1 ounce of marijuana, leaving the states free to adopt whatever laws they wish concerning marijuana.
A 1978 scandal surrounding allegations that Carter's drug advisor, Peter Bourne, had snorted cocaine at a Christmas party derailed Carter's decriminalization hopes, and instead, the drug war continued to escalate. When Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980, he got tough on drugs.
Last year alone, over 10,000 drug criminals were convicted, and nearly $250 million of their assets were seized by the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration.
And while taxpayer dollars flowed to drug warriors, Nancy Reagan spearheaded prevention efforts with her Just Say No campaign.
There's no moral middle ground. Indifference is not an option. We want you to help us create an outspoken intolerance for drug use.
I am Mike Tyson, a professional fighter. You can keep drugs out of your life and knock them out of society by saying no. Say no to drugs.
After being elected in 1988, George Bush got tough on drugs too.
Our 1990 drug budget totals almost $8 billion, the largest increase in history.
Look, everybody wants to be cool, but doing it with crack isn't just wrong. It could be dead wrong.
We've already transformed the national attitude of tolerance into one of condemnation. But the war on drugs will be hard won, neighborhood by neighborhood, block by block, child by child.
They want you to believe this is some kind of knights in shining armor battle of good versus evil.
I experimented with marijuana a time or two, and I didn't like it. and didn't inhale.
In 1992, admitted pot smoker Bill Clinton was elected president, and he got tough on drugs too.
We submitted the biggest drug budget ever. We have dramatically increased control and enforcement at the border. We supported a crime bill that had 60 death penalties, including the death penalty for drug kingpins.
When George W. Bush was elected in 2000, he followed in his father's footsteps, and in the wake of 9/11, he launched a propaganda campaign attempting to link drug users to terrorists.
You killed me.
What?
There was a bomb. I was going to school.
What did that have to do with me?
You brought drugs.
As the feds continued to escalate the war on drugs, states began passing laws allowing the medicinal use of marijuana. Predictably, the feds under Bush cracked down on medical marijuana dispensaries, arguing the federal law trumps state law. In 2007, a solid majority of Americans supported the medicinal use of marijuana. Mitt Romney, however, did not.
I have muscular dystrophy. That's completely against my DNA.
I'm sorry to hear that.
My question for you is, will you arrest me and my doctors if I get medical marijuana prescribed?
I'm not in favor of medical marijuana being
So will you have me arrested?
Hi. How are you?
Of course, waging war isn't free, and the amount of taxpayer dollars devoted to the drug war has increased significantly since Nixon declared war.
If one wants to compare the drug war of the late 60s, early 70s to today, start off with the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. In 1967, the lead federal drug control agency, I think its budget was $3 million. Now the budget of its successor agency, the DEA, is over $2 billion a year.
Do you realize that half of what we spend on law enforcement, the courts, and the prisons is drug-related?
How much money in total has the U.S. government spent waging its war on drugs?
The best estimate, it was one that was come up by the AP, it was that we've spent roughly $1 trillion on this war on drugs.
Okay, so drug prohibition has been expensive, but has it reached its goals?
What we've observed over time is that the U.S. has sometimes successfully pushed down on the production and distribution from some countries, and what happens in 6 months, a year or two, is the production moves somewhere else. I think of it as being like a waterbed. You can press the water down on one part of the bed, but it's going to pop up someplace else.
You know, one of the goals was to keep drugs out of the country, and what demonstrates that we can't is that more tonnage is coming in and prices are going down.
I held the record for the largest drug prosecution in the Central District of California back in 1978, 75 kilos of heroin, 160 pounds, which was and is a whole lot of heroin. Does anyone have a concept of what the drug prosecution record is today in the Central District of California? 18 tons of cocaine in one place.
You can buy almost any illegal drug in any city in this country, almost any neighborhood in this country, 24/7.
Marijuana usage rates vary over time. But it's hard to argue that the war against marijuana has been effective when daily use rates among 18-year-olds are the highest they've been in 30 years.
We're giving very mixed signals here about marijuana as to whether or not it's something that really is condemned by society or not. And so it doesn't surprise me that you've seen a spike in the usage.
And for hard drugs like heroin, usage rates have remained essentially flat for decades.
The only drug that we've been effective in reducing use is nicotine, tobacco. And you know what? We didn't send a single person to prison or fire a single shot to do that.
Obviously, we're no closer now than we were then.
They haven't made a dent. They haven't made a dent since Nixon made marijuana Schedule I drug in 1970. They're never going to make a dent.
This is a colossal failure.
It's really no surprise that drug prohibition has failed to achieve its goals. After all, alcohol prohibition didn't work either.
Alcohol prohibition and drug prohibition are very similar in most important respects. Okay? In both cases, we have a substance that a significant fraction of the population seems to want to consume. And it follows from economics that if you try to outlaw such a substance, there's going to be a black market that supplies it.
What you saw was people switching from beer and wine to hard liquor because it was much more compact and lucrative to traffic in that rather than something that was 96 or 95% water. What else happened? Al Capone and organized crime and rising levels of violence and corruption, overflowing jail cells and courthouses, tens of millions of Americans violating the law and being identified as criminals, a general deterioration in support for law and order. Now flash forward to today, it's the same thing except on a much more massive scale.
Can we win the war on drugs?
every single sort of few years we hear the prohibitionists in Washington say, well, if we just keep trying, if we just devote a little bit more money, a few more, more arrests, more military, we'll be able to win the war. And of course, it's never been true. If you look at places that are very repressive, that are not shy about using really, really strong tactics, prisons being one example, okay, there's tons of drugs in prison.